Hello and welcome to the FinTech Finance Virtual Arena. I'm your host, Doug Mackenzie, and on today's session, we're actually going to be looking into Bloom Money. And joining me is none other than Nina Mohanty, the founder of Bloom Money. Nina, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it is our pleasure, and I'm really excited to learn more about Bloom Money. It's so fascinating, but I guess before we kind of dive into that, could you tell our audience a bit about yourself and your quite exciting journey leading up to Bloom Money?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny that I'm now known as someone who works in fintech, but that wasn't always my life's ambition. I'm an American, as you can probably tell from my accent, and I moved to the UK actually to work in the Foreign Commercial Service. So I worked in the Obama administration, and public service has always been my first love, and probably has brought me full circle to Bloom. But after working in the Foreign Commercial Service, I kind of fell into fintech. I use that language because we now are at a point where there's lots of courses and things where people make a decision to enter fintech as an industry. And at the time, frankly, I had no idea what it was. So my first job was working at MasterCard in digital payments. And it was a very serendipitous time because it was around that time when the challenger banks were really starting to take off. And so you had Revolut on the MasterCard start path, and Monzo was Mondo, and they were a prepaid card, and Starling hadn't even launched yet. So it was a really exciting time to be in the middle of it all. Yeah. And then I went on and helped Starling actually launch the current account, got to work really closely with some of the great team there, and then headed over to Bud and helped grow the open banking platform that they were building. Went from a team of maybe 12 in a studio off of Brick Lane into about 100 people when I then went to Klarna. And Klarna's a hot name right now. It was a really exciting time to join. I helped with the US expansion efforts, moved home briefly to California, and then came back because I missed London, but I also missed being closer to product, and so was looking after kind of strategy and expansion and new products that are coming to the UK and the US. And so all this was going on, and I think the entire time, as I mentioned, public service was my first love. Yeah. But I really was enamored with this idea of fintech for good. And I thought, wow, this is, when I was at MasterCard, Monzo and Revolut were saying, we're going to put a bank account in every person's hand. And that was really powerful. And I think since then, it's been years now, we have made huge strides in consumer fintech, but there are still pockets, specific demographics that aren't fully being served the way they deserve to be. And so this is what led me to Bloom. I have always been very passionate about migration and the positive effects of immigration. And so Bloom is really building familiar financial services for migrant communities.
Incredible. And I think that's such a brilliant grounding to have, because obviously MasterCard themselves do so much work when it comes to fintech for good, finance for good, and then to really see the industry change. I'm so excited to kind of unpack all those experiences that you've had. Now, part of that, obviously, as you've mentioned, led up to Bloom Money, but I'm really excited to kind of hear what was the inspiration, the impetus behind Bloom Money. What was the moment where you're like, this has to happen?
Yes. So funnily enough, I'm pretty swotty, and this is a term that I learned.
It's so English.
I learned it from actually the author of a book who wrote in an inscription in the book that she wrote, "Cheers to Swotty Women," and I didn't know what swotty meant, but a swot is basically like a bookish, bookworm type of person, nerd. And probably end of 2019, I was really fascinated in the intersection of migration and financial services. In fact, I was looking at potentially doing a PhD in that actual topic. And so I was going about doing a lot of research, speaking to people, asylum seekers, refugees, domestic workers, migrant workers, economist students, anyone who would speak to me, and asking them, what has your financial services journey been like? And the responses were fascinating. They were appalling. They were heartwarming. As I mentioned, we have done so much in fintech and come such a long way. It was really great to hear so many people say, yeah, actually, I've got a Monzo account, or I've got a Monese account. And it was wonderful to hear that. But there were still so many gaps. And it's funnily enough, today I received an email from a woman who is trying to help a settled refugee get access to a credit card. And it's like a year on, it's the same kind of problems that I was identifying. And so what I was trying to understand is, where are the gaps? Where could we be doing better? And it hadn't really occurred to me that I should be the one to do it, or that, I should go found a business to solve the problem. But I started speaking to a bunch of people. I spoke to my director of studies from my master's program, and he said, it feels like there's a business here. I don't know, you tell me. And I said, that's really interesting. And I'm someone that very much believes that the best businesses are the ones that are solving a problem and not a solution chasing a problem. And I had identified a problem, which was this huge gap in financial services for migrants. And so that was really where Bloom came from. But I'll also add that I'm quite active in kind of doing work with the First Love Foundation, which is a food bank in Tower Hamlets. I do a lot of
Tower Hamlets here.
Yep, I do a lot of work with refugee and migrant charities. And so I knew a lot of people and was working with and interacting with people every day, every week, who have experienced these things firsthand, who have the lived experience and the struggle and the problems that we were looking to solve. And so it seems like that is when the seeds of Bloom, pun intended, were planted. And it's been such a wonderful journey to be on so far.
Well, it sounds absolutely brilliant, and I'm so excited to hear more and what's going to be happening in the future. But I think for maybe some of the audience that are in different sectors of finance and kind of are unaware of these granular movements and how much this means to people, I've got to ask, what does financial inclusion mean to you specifically?
That's a really good question. And I think it's very important to start there and make sure we have a base level understanding of what we're talking about. And I say this because it's become very in vogue to paint fintech companies as financial inclusion companies. So you have various fintech companies who kind of say, we're a financial inclusion company because we're providing mortgages to people, or we're a financial inclusion because we're democratizing access to markets, and that's fine. I really like the World Bank's definition of financial inclusion. And so to them, financial inclusion means that individuals and also businesses have access to useful and affordable financial products and services, but most importantly, are delivered in a responsible and sustainable way. And so, one of the problem spaces that we're looking at is access to fair credit. And oftentimes when I speak to potential investors or, people who are curious about Bloom, and they say, oh, so is there no access to credit for migrants? And I have to say, well, no, that's not true. There is not no access, or rather, it's not that there aren't options available for credit. There are many. There are loan sharks, there are pawnbrokers, there are payday lenders, but that doesn't really fit the definition of responsible or sustainable, right? And so it's really important that I think we clarify, and thank you so much for allowing me to define that. I think another thing about financial inclusion, or a fallacy, is that financial inclusion is something that's happening over there, over in the developing countries and emerging markets. So we see a lot of chatter about, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. That's brilliant. And I think that the companies that are tackling those problems out there are wonderful. If I weren't doing Bloom, I'd probably want to work for them. But one of those misconceptions is that financial inclusion isn't a problem here in the UK, here in the Western world, when actually the FCA estimates that there's 1 million adults in the UK that still don't have access to a bank account. And we know that there are, a dear friend of mine, Andra Sinea, did a piece of research for her PhD where she found that there are she calls them the void, but they're dead spots where people actually don't have access to banking infrastructure. So they're meant to be able to go to a post office and bank at a post office, for example, where someone's had a partnership with the post office, but actually the post office is in a tiny town where it's only open 1 hour a week. And so they don't actually have access to that unless they can leave work and be there during that 1 hour, right? And so there's definitely a financial inclusion demographic that needs serving here in the UK as well.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of, I think almost the term is like invisible people that just fall between pillars, and as a result, the finance industry hasn't served them. And that does need to change, and in this digital environment, that can't keep being a thing. Obviously, when it comes to Bloom Money, you are effectively going out and tackling these issues. You're actually going right to the source. Now, large institutions, as we've just discussed, for 200, 400, thousands of years, have just not bothered to attempt to rectify that issue. You're doing that. So, what are the challenges involved with that?
Yeah, I think it's such a tough one because it's a hard pill to swallow. It's one of those inconvenient truths, as former Vice President Al Gore would say, in that looking at financial inclusion or looking to financially include vulnerable groups is, first of all, often viewed as charity. So this is something that we come up against quite often. And oftentimes people say, you should incorporate as a charity. And don't get me wrong, there are so many charities, and as I mentioned, I do a lot of volunteer work with them who are doing amazing work. But it's almost this idea that we actually don't want to serve that population and we can just leave that to the third sector to take care of these problems. And that, no one wants to be referred to as a charity case. There's, absolutely no agency. There is this feeling of dependency and can things be withheld if I don't do what a charity caseworker wants me to do, that sort of thing, right? And so the first thing is, oftentimes when we talk about serving low income or brown or black people or marginalized people, that is just automatically assumed to be charity. And a big part of that is because the current financial system in the West has typically been built for a very specific customer. I am not that customer because I'm a brown woman. But, the typical customer that the current financial system here in the UK and the US was built for was for a straight white man. And, that worked for centuries because that was, who was around. But, well, not that there weren't other people around, but that was who was in power. And we are now living in a time where we have reached a maturation of fintech where there are the tools available to provide very specific services to specific demographics, but also the need for that as well, right? So along with that, the challenges are the misconception that people who are from migrant communities are not credit worthy. So a question I get asked a lot is, how do you know that they're going to pay you back? What is their credit score? What's the average credit score of your target demographic? And it's an interesting one to answer because the problem, the catch-22 there is we don't know because so much of of the financial activity that a lot of migrant communities or communities of color take part in are informal financial systems. So they aren't necessarily going down the street to Lloyd's or Barclays or Halifax to get a personal loan or a credit card, right? And in large part, this is due to the fact that they don't have a credit file or a credit footprint in this country. And so because of that, it's just easier to, lend money, borrow money, pool money amongst themselves, with their community, with their friends and family. And that actually means that there is quite a bit of wealth moving around in migrant communities. But when it comes time to use that wealth and kind of transition into the formal financial system, all of a sudden we come against, the issue of, wait a second, you don't have a credit file, you don't have a credit score, we don't know how to price your risk anymore. And this becomes a bit daunting for the formal financial system and for banks to kind of go, wait a second, we don't know how to price this. There's no 3-digit number to attach to you. And so something that I found speaking to customers is actually, I was speaking to my nail technician, and she's Vietnamese, British, and between her and her cousins, they do pooling of money, where we're talking about tens of thousands of pounds moving around just within a small family unit, So it's not that there isn't money, it's not that there isn't credit worthiness there, it just hasn't been formalized. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with Bloom, is to formalize and digitize these existing informal financial systems. So coming across these misconceptions and trying to educate people has been a big challenge, but very much worthwhile, and something that I'm happy to do because it needs to be done.
Yeah, to me, it's almost absurd that so much of finance, despite the fact that every financial transaction, whether it be a transaction of money or a financial service, it's so ubiquitous, and yet some people are still not visible in these systems. So we need to democratize that visibility, and then suddenly everyone can get on board. And I think that's absolutely incredible that you guys are attempting that, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. And it actually leads me to a question that I was going to ask later on, but I think you've kind of alluded to it, and it's kind of the way that Bloom Money operates, and that's with Bloom Circles. So could you tell our viewers a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, what we're trying to do is take existing informal financial systems, and this is replicable across a lot of different financial services. It's not just Bloom Circles, but this is where we're starting. So we are digitizing and formalizing a method of borrowing and saving that has existed in many cultures for decades, if not centuries. And it is academically known as a ROSCA, so a rotating savings and credit association. The beautiful thing about it is, as I mentioned, it exists in so many cultures in the global south. So my father is from Odisha in India, and we call it Hattadar in Odisha. My mother from Taiwan, my grandmother used to take part in these circles. They're called Hui. But then, more relevant here, we have Bangladeshi and Pakistani families here in the UK who take part. They call it committee. Somali communities will call them Hegbad, or Jamea if you're in an Arabic-speaking country, or Nigerians will call them Ajo or Isusu. And they are basically a group of people who come together and form a syndicate. So you've got a group of people who and they come together and they say, right, okay, we're going to put in £100 every month. And that means that there's a syndicate pool for someone to take away and do whatever they want with it. And this allows for both borrowing and saving, depending on when you withdraw that pool of money, right? So the beautiful thing about this that I keep coming back to is it's happening right here in London, in the UK, in communities around us. I speak to people who do it at church. I speak to people who do it with their mosque groups. My nail tech takes part in a circle like this. And so, as I said, the beautiful thing with Bloom is we're not having to recreate the wheel or the circle in this case. What we are doing is just providing a digital app to be able to have people safely and securely take part, but then also in the future be rewarded for taking part and kind of transitioning them into the formal financial system.
I think that it's so brilliant here, and it's almost, I keep alluding to it, but it's almost absurd that it hasn't happened before. It's almost at the point of screaming, because as you said, this has been happening in the global south and even northern hemisphere as well, but just informally. And as soon as you put that formality to it, then you reduce the risk, and it's absolutely brilliant to see how that's going to help communities out hugely. And now I think one thing as well, obviously one thing that maybe some of the institutions previously have not looked to this sector is because people in this sector are time poor. It's rarely discussed how time poor recently migrated people are. Especially even if you speak the language, everything is still a headache to do. I remember myself trying to open up a bank account and then also trying to close it in a country where I didn't speak the language too well, and it possibly could have taken off 5 years of my life. Now, the traditional financial institutions have failed to offer an easy-to-use, seamless financial service despite living in a global economy. So how is Bloom Money different? How do you enable all these different communities, different languages to get on board easily and understand what they're getting involved with?
Yes, so that is such an important question. Thank you for asking it. I just started this book last night. It's called Hired, and it's undercover in low wage Britain. But it's already hit on a lot of the points that you made, which is a lot of migrants that come to this country, we maybe don't think about it as much, but perhaps in the past year have thought about it more, in large part due to the fact that a lot of our essential workforce is made up of migrants, including the NHS, doctors, nurses, carers, but also the people who put food on our shelves, who clean our offices, right? And so what we also know is that there is a rising cost of living, especially in urban areas, especially where people, communities of color or migrant communities live. And so this whole time poor aspect means, working long shifts, whether that's taking one of the migrant couples that I work with, the husband gets in a car for an hour to drive to a Sainsbury fulfillment center outside of Leeds. And that's just to start his shift. And then he's on his feet for, his entire shift, and then has to drive an hour back. So this has ramifications for everything in terms of when are you able to go to the bank and withdraw money, or to, go to a class on how to budget, or when do you have time to cook a nutritious meal when you've been in an Amazon fulfillment warehouse all day, and there's a McDonald's around the corner and a cheeseburger is 99p. Well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So there's a lot of different intersecting bits here. There's lots of things that I'm passionate about, things about education, about food health, but also just the fact that the demographic that we're looking to serve is so wildly different than who the incumbent financial system was built to serve. So we are looking at women, but we are also looking at people of color, whether they come from the Caribbean, from various African countries, from Southeast Asia, who have different religions. And this is a really important one that I like to touch on, because there's an interesting statistic. So 18% of the UK population is living at or below the poverty line. 50% of Muslim households are living at or below the poverty line. And, I wouldn't be surprised. I would never dare to say that there's a correlation there, but correlation is not causation. There's not a causation there, but I would venture to guess and hypothesize that not having access to financial services that are built for them and accessible for their faith maybe plays a part in that as well. There's so many different things, and so it's both beautiful because it creates a very vibrant product that is trying to be inclusive to all, but also difficult because there are so many different things we need to take into consideration, like becoming Sharia compliant. For one, that's great, and we can definitely make sure that our Muslim customers are aware that it's Sharia compliant and that it's been certified as such. But then, that maybe isn't as relevant to, say, a Nigerian Pentecostal Christian, and so maybe we don't market that to them, and there's some other sort of interesting thing that's more pertinent to them. But it also means better understanding someone's lifestyle and their life cycle. And, as someone who has worked at a few fintech companies now, we tend to paint people with one broad brush, and their differentiators tend to be around gender lines maybe, or maybe income level, but they're still within a certain band of or demographic of population. I'm thinking, Starlings, Klarna, but even the Revoluts of the world or the Monzos of the world, you're very much looking at kind of urban dwelling people who have disposable income, that sort of thing. And so we're really trying to take that into consideration. We're trying to take into consideration that, family is very important and community is very important, and baking that into the product, both in a physical and digital sense. And the tagline, I shouldn't call it a tagline. What do you call it? Our motto, our vision is prosperity for all. And what that really ultimately means is, what can we do to equip our customers to create a prosperous future for themselves, for their family, and more broadly for their community. And so I suppose that's how it's different in a nutshell.
Well, I think it's absolutely brilliant to hear. I've said that before earlier in the conversation, but it is such a huge task, and you've taken it on and you're doing it properly, because it just has to be. It has to be perfect. As we mentioned, these people are time poor, and so the product has to be perfect. Now, we've talked about gaining access to financial services as the key differentiator of what the key meaning of what financial inclusion is. But it can go one step further, and we're seeing, for instance, even currently in the UK, women are incredibly underserved when it comes to credit. The disparity is huge. Now, when we look at deeper financial services, more advanced financial services, can you tell me a bit more about how Bloom Money can help customers improve their credit score, and maybe even offer up those advanced financial services later on in the timeline?
Yeah, so you're completely right, by the way. I saw Credit Karma report that the gender credit gap in the UK is 17%, which was pretty astounding for 2021. There's a lot of wonderful, positive financial behavior. There's so many misconceptions we have to overcome. So we talked about the misconception that migrant communities are not creditworthy, but also there's the misconception that actually all migrants need is access to remittance services, and done and dusted, that's all the financial services they need.
That's
Cheers,
fintech
right?
Done.
Yeah, that's fintech. That's it. That's done. And while I think, businesses like Wise, I always have to catch myself.
You forget use the transfer.
I know. Wise and Osmo and World Remit. Actually, World Remit and Osmo are both co-founded by women, so we'll shout them out. There remains other things that people want to do with their lives besides send money home. And so what we're looking at is different positive financial behavior markers that we can reward. I think the credit rating agencies, and if there's anyone from Experian or Equifax or TransUnion that's watching this and wants to get in touch, please do. I think they are, especially in a world of open banking, as we move towards open finance, are far more aware that, open banking could really come for their lunch money. And there's lots of different businesses like Credit Kudos. Huge fan of what they're doing. I think Freddie and his team are brilliant in being able to use, quote, alternative data to assess someone's creditworthiness. And so what we're trying to do is identify what are those positive markers. Because I don't know about you, I've now had to build up a credit score in 2 different countries and nearly did in a third. It's a black box. You know, like I really struggled to get a credit card when I first moved here because I didn't have any credit footprint. So there's, you know, the incremental, let's start building your credit footprint, your file. And then how do we start building your credit score, get you on the electoral roll? But even things like that, I was thinking about this today, you know, someone signing up to the electoral roll is kind of from a different era where people didn't move around as much, where, you know, even registering with a GP based on your postcode is quite a almost antiquated idea to me now, because people do move so frequently. So there's lots of different things where, what are the different data points? What are the different transactions that we can use to identify through open banking, for example, or that we can report to an Experian or an Equifax or TransUnion to help build up these credit scores to then kind of graduate our customers into the formal financial system. Because the truth is, there are, as I said, there is money, there is wealth that exists in these communities. There are people who are ready and willing to buy homes. They would love to get a mortgage with Lloyd's, with HSBC, but they can't because they don't have a credit footprint, right? So we're looking at that. We're looking at, you know, insurance, which is obviously a big problem, especially in communities of color, where we know that there are health issues at stake here because of the nature of the work that a lot of migrant communities take on. So the roadmap, luckily, is never ending. So we're on this, you know, infinite journey to really serve migrant communities. And, you know, banks are still around serving straight white men. So I know that we will be around for quite some time to be able to serve migrant communities.
Definitely, and it is so exciting to hear this kind of this growing of, you know, you starting at the grassroots level and you know, offering remittance and also the ability to save, but then suddenly, you know, as it moves forward, as it grows, you can then offer up these services that need to be democratized, because if you look at financial services, the pie only gets bigger if the more people are involved. So it's absolutely brilliant. And
that's definitely something, you know, I very much loved my time at MasterCard. And when I was at MasterCard, Ajay Banga was the CEO, but I know that Michael Miebach now is towing a similar line, which is that, you know, you can, what is it that they say? Doing good by doing well. Referring to this this triple bottom line, where you can actually do really well, but also grow the pie. And the more people that are included, the better, because I mean, that serves everyone in this ecosystem that we're working in, whether that's MasterCard or Visa and the schemes, or incumbent banks, or remittances. You know, even when Wise went public just a few weeks ago, they were saying, like, there's still billions of pounds of unnecessary fees that are being paid. They've been around for what, a decade at least now? Yeah, so, and they still have a long way to go, and I love that. And the idea is, like, you know, it's never ending. We're always going to keep working to make things better, more equitable, more fair. So yeah, if you're interested, get in touch.
Definitely, yeah. It was doing well by doing good, from Jay Banger, yeah. And so I think it's absolutely exciting. For myself as well, just, you know, being, you know, at the heart of the fintech industry and seeing it actually, finance is almost considered from outside as almost this nefarious industry, and now to hear that it's actually moving in this direction, it's so exciting. Now, if we can wrap up, I got to ask, you know, what's next for Bloom Money? Where can people find out more? Where can people start doing more, and how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you can find us at bloommoney.co. not com. Haven't been able to buy that domain yet. But it's bloommoney.co. You know, I am prolific on Twitter, on LinkedIn. You know, what's next is we've launched our pilot, and it's been really great to have customers come on board and say to us that, you know, we've been waiting for this. It's always such a pleasure to hear that, to know that we are actually solving a problem. Beyond that, you know, my hope is we're seeing a tipping point, I think, in terms of ESG investments and green finance and that sort of thing, where I remember even 5 years ago, people referred to anyone trying to do anything green or carbon offsetting almost as charity, right? Or like not necessary. And now it's like of the utmost important. And I think, not to end it on a sad note, but I personally believe that climate change is the single largest existential threat to humanity, right? But with climate change, as we work to mitigate climate change, a lot of the people that get swept up in that are migrants, people from the global south, lower income people, where we even know here in the UK, lower income people who tend to live by motorways have, you know, greater chances of having asthma or other respiratory conditions. So there is an equality issue with climate change that directly impacts communities of color and migrant communities. And so I'm hoping that, you know, the journey that climate tech or climate fintech has been on is something that will then also be replicated with what we're trying to do at Bloom, and that there will be a recognition that this is not charity, that this is not a fad or a trend, but, you know, this is here to stay, and previously marginalized communities or vulnerable populations also deserve to be served and can be profitable as well. So yes, if that's something that you believe and that you want to help us do, definitely contact us, hello@bloommoney.co, or find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'd love to chat more.
Perfect. Well, I think it's absolutely brilliant. And Nina, we're coming up to time. Thank you so much for kind of just, you know, showing me all that. It sounds like Bloom Money is just going to be absolutely brilliant, and it's such a big step in putting the money where people's mouths are. For instance, as you said with ESG, you know, before it was this kind of you know, nebulous term that people just used as an offcut. Then the people, you know, the money went there, and now every bank's talking about it. So let's hope that, you know, we can do the same with Bloom Money. And also, thank you so much to our viewers. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over at www.fintechf.com, and of course YouTube and LinkedIn, where I'll see you in the comments. So Nina, once again, thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.